think about the growth of where the digital audio market is going, I see this merger not necessarily for the footprint of where it is today, but kind of creating this net new kind of digital world around podcasts. In the US alone, if they were to merge tomorrow, they'd be about 42% of the entire audio market, which is just wild. And that's like all of audio, not just digital, but also radio and all of these things. I mean, you're talking about a company that between the two of them is almost half of the audio market in the US. That's just wild from a market share perspective, but also begs the question of like, in this merger, what are the synergies, right?
You're listening to Media Monitor, where we break down what's happening in the media and the advertising industry and tell you what it actually means. Welcome back, Sean. How you doing?
Great. How are you, Kelly?
I am good. I'm excited for today because I think it's time to do something we haven't done in a while, which is, and I'm trying to remember what we agreed our best name for it is.
Was it a morsel?
You love the morsels.
I do.
You love the morsels, the
I'm
media
a big guy,
morsels.
so it's like, yeah, food is never far from my mind.
Well, I think we said media morsels or our guideline grab bag, but we've got some stuff to talk about in the headlines, and we've been doing deeper dives on specific topics. So we thought today we'd zoom out and cover a few things. This is what I had, starting with OpenAI and the lawsuit that's going on, talking a little bit about iHeart and the Sirius, the merger there, or the talks for that. The social media ban in Australia, we are now coming up on 1 year and have some data to talk through. And then some news out of Amsterdam and their take on what is no longer going to be allowed on their billboards.
Yeah, I think those are all great. I would also kind of toss in, related to Australia, the recent news that the UK might be following in their footsteps. So I think it's just an interesting time coming off of 2 episodes ago where we talked around like, is now the time where there might be some changing winds related to Meta and all of that social media around like concern for teen harm. So we'll kind of get into it for sure.
Absolutely. All right. So without further ado, let's talk about OpenAI. They concluded testimony this week. And for those who are less filled in on this, this is Elon versus Altman, and essentially Musk filing a lawsuit saying, hey, you misled me. This was supposed to be a charity. It's not. And, let's get into it. So, Sean, talk to me about your takes on this and kind of give me what you got.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting in that it's kind of a string of bad news for, OpenAI collectively. So kind of coming off this week, right? They have the lawsuit. There's this change in direction saying we now want to kind of pursue revenue and go after kind of dollars in a big way. But then we also were hit this week with reporting from the Wall Street Journal that said, OpenAI likely missed their revenue and user targets for Q1 and are now also, open question of whether or not they can kind of afford some of the compute that they had, earmarked into the future in terms of paying and all of these things because they're not on track. And so it's this really fascinating dynamic where you have Musk saying, hey, you guys were supposed to be a charity. This was supposed to be not kind of profit focused. And then on the flip side, you have them getting crushed from the other end of like, they are trying to be profit focused and are missing targets kind of right out the gate, especially kind of this is the first kind of quarter that they have advertising. We've started to see ad spend in our data, still very, very small, right? We weren't expecting to kind of see huge amounts of dollars in our tools, but we do see, and they are increasing kind of month over month. I think it's way too early to kind of figure out, is this better than average? Is it average? Is it less than average? But we are starting to see the dollars trickle in. But based on what we're seeing, yeah, I think it probably is contributing to their miss on both revenue and user targets. Again, not kind of like, earth shattering or, an end as we know it to kind of ChatGPT and OpenAI, but it is fascinating because they were the ones that kind of led the whole charge, right? When we think about 3-ish years ago at this point of like AI is here. You can do all of these things with ChatGPT, right? And for basically a full year, it was ChatGPT this, ChatGPT this, that, and it's not anymore. So I think it's kind of an interesting dynamic, a bad week in terms of headlines for OpenAI that, at least in terms of the reporting, doesn't seem to be getting any better anytime soon.
No. And you make a really good point that ChatGPT was kind of the Kleenex of AI in its early days. And here we are. I'm hearing from people that they can't even get on Anthropic on the phone to get an enterprise account because business is booming over there. So it's really interesting to see this ecosystem shift. Good call out on seeing some advertising spend dollars flowing through our pipes from OpenAI. I think what I saw was from January to March, it was, and again, small dollars, but it looked like it was like March was 2.5 times what January was. We're anticipating to see that continue to accelerate, but we'll be curious to watch it.
Yeah, I think internal targets, they kind of said that they're hoping to get to a $2.5 billion ad business by year end. We don't cover everybody in our tools, right? Or at least I should say, not everyone who buys ads comes in through our spend. So obviously we don't have full visibility into the market, but I am hard pressed on how you get to 2.5 billion. Given some of the early months read that we've seen here. If you told me like 1.2 billion, 1.3 billion, especially, as they consider to open up ads globally, not just in the United States, I could kind of be like, yeah, I could maybe see that. But again, not that we cover the entire market, but it is curious to see how close they're going to get to that $2.5 billion target based on what we're seeing today.
Yeah, we'll have to do kind of end of year, a little recap of any of the predictions that we made in the beginning to see how they panned out.
Yeah.
But speaking of big players in spaces, 2 other big players, SiriusXM and iHeart, I think it's
some of the biggest.
Some of the biggest. I think it's worth us spending a minute to talk about SiriusXM, reportedly in talks to acquire iHeart. What is this going to mean for a merger like this? What does this mean for America's largest satellite radio provider and largest terrestrial radio station owner to come together?
Yeah.
Talk to me.
Yeah, right. I think it's a combination of looking at the terrestrial kind of old school radio format that is still in use every day, still sees a couple $2 billion in terms of ad revenue, but is, slowly declining. Satellite kind of has this static base. A lot of what I was reading is they haven't really lost a lot of users in this space. Like they've lost marginally, but it's kind of just flat, right? Not everyone's investing in satellite radio. But interestingly, particularly for iHeart, and to a lesser extent Sirius, iHeart has a massive podcast library that is really their growth engine right now. Similarly, Sirius has a few out there, right? But they're not as necessarily as big heavy hitters like iHeart/Culturalistas, right? Which is like the number 1 podcast in our data for 2025 from an ad revenue perspective. And so kind of collectively, right, if we think about the growth of where the digital audio market is going, I see this merger not necessarily for the footprint of where it is today, but kind of creating this net new kind of digital world around podcasts that is kind of, from a scale perspective, bar none, one of the biggest. In the US alone, if they were to merge tomorrow, they'd be about 42% of the entire audio market, which is just wild. And that's like all of audio, right? It's not just digital, but also radio and all of these things. I mean, you're talking about a company that between the two of them is almost half of the audio market in the US. That's wild from a market share perspective, but also begs the question of like, in this merger, what are the synergies, right? Yeah, you talk about the footprint between kind of, terrestrial and satellite, but everyone knows that those are kind of, flat to downish segments, right? So it's a question of, from a podcast perspective, how much redundancy is there? How much do they actually have to grow? Because chances are they're also probably talking to a lot of the same advertisers. It's one thing if like they were representative of different segments of the market, if like one captured a lot of SMB, one captured a lot of like big brands, but collectively they get both. So it's a question of, how much revenue can these companies grow incrementally if they both kind of talk to the same businesses, get the same ad spend from each other? But yeah, it's a massive company if they were to merge.
Yeah. And, I think it's just underscoring what we already knew, that podcasting is the future, right, Sean?
Absolutely. You could do it anywhere. In the comfort of a spare bedroom, a kitchen, anywhere.
Anywhere. Well, I was also reading this week about Oprah's deal with Amazon and bringing her media empire to their platform, including exclusive distribution of the Oprah podcast. And, the way that Amazon's thinking about this is making this whole ecosystem. It's not just about the pod, it's about all of the branded content. Maybe there's big sponsorship deals with specific products that their, partners are touting. So it's going to be really interesting to see where this goes, not just from, this side, but from a podcast ecosystem in general, right?
For sure. And I think with Amazon too, it's interesting because they're kind of a clearinghouse, right? They have their own products. They have, Prime Video, they have AWS, but also between all of their partnerships, right? They also kind of are the DSP for many streamers today. When you log into a Fire TV, you see all of their products, but you could also go and kind of navigate your way into Paramount Plus or all of these things. And then they also have that whole channel library where you could like go in and watch, Showtime or all of these things. So there's kind of this interesting piece to your point on they are getting into the space, but they are also like trying to be a little bit of everything from a media world. They're almost like a kind of de facto cable company if a cable company was started in the digital era. And so it's kind of interesting just in terms of where we're seeing growth. And, they also just kind of came out with earnings, which wildly kind of blew expectations out of the market. But interestingly, a lot of like the ad growth was there, but a lot of it was coming from AWS and kind of the use of AI, which was a similar narrative we heard out of Google as well, where a lot of their growth, not that, YouTube didn't grow a hair under 11%, but, AWS was just kind of like exploded in Q1. I think it was the fastest growth maybe ever, or, at least for like the last 2 or 3 years from a growth perspective. And all of it kind of tied to AI, going back to the whole,
there you go.
OpenAI, ChatGPT thing. So,
yeah, well, we're definitely going to have to keep tabs on that. But let's move from the northern hemisphere, Seattle, down to the southern hemisphere, and let's touch on the Australia social media ban, because I think in one of our pilot episodes that I don't even know if we ever made it to air, we talked about this ban. Now we're coming up on a year, which is a really interesting point in time for us because we can see how it has impacted things. Saying that kids can't access social media is a huge change, a big statement. What are the numbers showing us?
Yeah, I think this can be met with maybe reading in two ways. One would be a womp womp, where there's an attempt to shut down social media for teens. And not that it solely is what drove advertising in Australia, but if we look at just from an ad perspective, Meta right now, specifically, given that they were kind of a large focus, is up 4% kind of in the first quarter for Australia. The overall market is down 0.3. So essentially, legitimately just flat. So it's kind of performing at 4x the market and also has kind of maintained that ratio consistently for the last couple of quarters. And so at least from an ad revenue perspective, there is no material change in terms of both bad headlines. We talked a little bit, right, 2-ish podcasts ago where we said, hey, look, like I'm a little skeptical that like with some of these court cases, with some of the decisions, with the very clear evidence that it is harmful for children, that it's going to do anything from an ad perspective. And at least like the evidence so far seems to be holding it up where you're looking and you're like, well, Meta's still doing great in Australia. TikTok is still doing great in Australia. And again, ad revenue isn't necessarily users from like how many teens are off platform, but anecdotally, we've also read that like a lot of teens just kind of made up a new email address and created a new account, or kind of logged in through kind of a fake adult account and kind of skirted the intent by kind of getting around it. And the protections just aren't there to be like, whoa, like I saw you log in a minute ago as a different person. What are you doing? Right? That just doesn't exist. So I think that, part of that is there's probably not a huge drop off in terms of users and usage. But secondly, again, from an ad spend perspective, it just seems like it's a must-have for advertisers and agencies. And so we still see that continued growth both in the US, We saw it in Meta's earnings, last week, earlier this week. I'm getting kind of misaligned on my time here, but Meta had a solid quarter in terms of ad revenue growth. So their data says it, our data says it. That slowdown isn't happening from a social media ban perspective. Now, again, the UK has announced they're going to do it. I think China has kind of a similar ban in place. Canada instituted something like this 2-3 years ago. Specific states in the US have started to roll it out. So there might come a time where things do change direction, but Q1 of 2026 is not that time.
That is fascinating. I, for one, thought we'd see some impact. But to your point, they're going to make up for it one way or another. They're going to log in under a different account. It's just they're going to find a way. So yeah. We'll keep tabs on this. Speaking of changing behaviors, I thought there was some really interesting news coming out of Amsterdam this morning that I want your take on. Amsterdam said, we would like to no longer permit advertisements in public spaces from kind of, I said, in my summary earlier to you, like things that are bad for the environment can't be advertised. Really what it is like fossil fuel kind of focused ads. So they said no advertisements for meat, for, kind of travel that's going to places that is really far and unnecessary. Talk to me about this ban. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's super interesting, right? And it is you see, it's not unprecedented to have bans of certain types of advertising depending on where you are, right? They can't do legal gambling in places. And in some ways it kind of makes sense. My immediate response to you this morning was like, oh yeah, it kind of makes sense, right? They're under threat in a big way by climate change and rising sea levels. And so it's an interesting kind of pivot to start with advertising. I liken it to kind of like if you want to change behavior around kids smoking cigarettes, stop advertising cigarettes and see what happens. And you fast forward and like, hey, it kind of worked. So this is kind of the first foray into seeing like, okay, if we kind of prevent the advertising of meat, do people consume less meat? I am more skeptical of the efficiencies there as opposed to like cigarette ads, but it's certainly a step. I think it's fascinating to watch. I wish we had ad spend there so that we could kind of see if we do see declines. That would be super cool. Or see it like, because I could almost imagine it kind of coming up in different ways, whether it's like, oh, well, they're going to stop advertising it on billboards, but like they're now doing something creative where it's not a meat ad per se, but it's this like targeted digital ad to talk about the benefit of the, beef industry or something, right? Like, I have to imagine that something like that will happen. I just wish that this is one of the countries that we were getting ad spend from. But unfortunately, we're kind of in the dark here, other than it being, to your point, a really fascinating headline.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there's an initiative to eat more plant-based proteins, which I'd love to see the data on this, 1 year from now. It'll be super interesting.
I thought you were going to say you loved eating plant-based proteins. That's a
well,
mouthful.
That too.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. I am a late stage convert to tofu. That's that's an aside. Yeah.
Well, I'm not late stage. I'm in the game. It's not something that my husband's interested in. So if you have any tips.
I don't. It's just repetition, really, and some decent sauces seems to do enough. We also marinate ours, which I think helps.
Ooh.
Not that we're going to turn into a cooking podcast here, but I think that helps because like it's kind of like just on its own doesn't taste like anything, but when you marinate it, it kind of absorbs a lot of like the flavors and the marinade itself, and then cook it up.
Yeah, you could dress it up. Dress it up.
Absolutely. I mean, to be clear, like I'm not just eating a block straight out of the container.
I know.
Yeah.
No morsels of tofu in your house. They need to be well seasoned, well marinated.
Yes.
Well, Sean, I have one more for you that I didn't prep you on because it's a headline for me this weekend. I am curious if you've got a horse in tomorrow's big race. The Kentucky Derby is tomorrow.
I thought you were literally going to stop at a horse. And I was like, can't
no,
say.
that was
It's like Guideline does not pay me enough to have my own stable of horses.
Are you rooting for anyone? Is this a
No.
thing for you, Sean?
No, I might
All right.
might at some point during the day have a bourbon, and that's about as close as I'm going to get.
Wow.
I will say, the one time I went to a horse, like a racetrack, I realized how fast you could slip down the slippery slope, because I put down one bet. It didn't pan out. But I decided the next round I was definitely going to. So I doubled my bet, different horse. Lost it, went back, tripled my bet. And I was like, you know what? I need to stop, because at this point, it's not working out for me. I know nothing about horse racing. The horses are running around the track. I'm out $100. I'm out. I can't do this. And that is the closest I've ever gotten to being a fan of horse racing. So
well,
how about you?
Renegade's the favorite,
okay.
But I'm pulling for So Happy because we're listening to a lot of Miss Rachel in this house.
Okay.
And she has a song that if you know it, you know it.
There you go. So
that's where my money is.
Nice.
Miss Rachel.
Miss Rachel. Well, I'll now have to watch to see if you pull through, or if it's the fan favorite. It's usually not the favorite. I know it's usually the favorite, but I feel like, I don't know.
Favorite.
This is, by the way, not a data-informed decision at all. It's just straight. I have looked at no horse racing data, so.
Well, Sean, I appreciate you being willing to offer up 3 minutes of your time for me this weekend, and I hope that you do.
I'll have a bourbon on you.
Yay!
Yeah.
All right, Sean, thank you so much. Love going through the headlines with you, and I will see you next week.
See you next week. Bye-bye. That's Media Monitor. Follow us and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts every Wednesday for a new episode. And as always, thanks for listening.